Wyoming Territory, September 1879. The fire took everything in less than 10 minutes. Flora Farnell stood barefoot in the dirt, her nightdress soaked in ash and tears as her home caved in on itself. The roof collapsed with a crack like thunder, sparks rising into the black sky. Her lungs burned. Her arms trembled from trying to drag what little she could from the flames: her saddlebag, a framed photograph, 2 small quilts. They had come at dusk. She knew them. 3 men from town, one of them a deputy. They did not wear masks. They rode up quiet, dismounted, and tossed kerosene without a word. They did not look her in the eye. They set fire to the house where she had lived with Wicasa, the Cheyenne man she had loved for nearly 4 years. The man she had married in spirit, if not in law. The man who should have been there tonight, but rode north to help his ailing uncle in Montana. They did not care that her heart beat for him. They only saw what they wanted to see: a white woman too close to the people they feared. Her knees gave out and she collapsed onto the cold ground. Behind her, the fire crackled. In the distance, a horse's hoofbeats faded into the hills. They left her alive on purpose. She knew that too. The next morning, she found the trail to the Cheyenne camp Wicasa had visited, but the scout who met her by the river shook his head. "He rode out at dawn," the man said. "Alone." "Why?" "He heard what happened to your place." Flora swallowed hard. "Where's he going?" The scout looked toward the mountains. "To finish what they started." 3 weeks passed. Wicasa never returned. Flora wandered between towns, her name whispered like a curse. Folks turned their faces. She ate only when someone pitied her enough to leave food by a fence post. Her hands cracked from cold. Her feet bled from miles walked. Every morning she checked the road for him. And every night she counted the stars just to feel less alone. On the 22nd day, she collapsed outside a barn near the Colorado border. When she woke, warmth touched her skin and a man was crouched nearby, tossing wood into a stove. His back was broad, his shoulders squared with the kind of strength that came from hard years. He turned when she stirred, and she saw a face marked by a long scar down the left jaw. His eyes were dark like wet soil, steady, not unkind. "You are safe," he said simply. His voice was low, rough from wind and time. She sat up too fast. Pain streaked down her side. "Where am I?" "Near Trinidad. I found you near the fence line. You had no shoes." "I do not remember much." "You do not need to. I am Dallin Kessler." She studied him. He was older than her by a few years, maybe 30. A cattleman by his worn coat and calloused hands, but there was something quieter in him, something watchful. He poured water from a kettle and brought it to her. She drank slowly, her throat raw. "I am Flora Farnell." He nodded once. "I know who you are." Her fingers tightened around the cup. "Then why help me?" He sat on a crate across from her. "Because I saw what they did. I saw the smoke. And I saw you walk through the hills like a ghost." He looked her in the eye. "You do not leave someone like that." She looked at her lap. "Others did." "I am not others." She believed him. By the 2nd day she could stand. By the 5th she helped feed his horses. Dallin did not ask questions she was not ready to answer. He spoke when needed. He watched her with quiet concern. She found herself drawn to the steadiness in him, how he never flinched when she cried, never looked away when her voice cracked. One night they sat by the fire just outside the barn. She pulled her coat tighter and stared at the flames. "He never came back," Flora whispered. Dallin did not ask who. "My Wicasa. He went after them, rode out alone." Her voice broke. "He should not have done that. He should have waited for me." Dallin was silent for a long time. Then he said, "Sometimes men think revenge is the same as love." She looked at him. "And what do you think?" "I think love is not burning something down. It is building something new." Her throat tightened. "I do not know if I can anymore." "You can," he said gently. "But you should not do it alone." Winter crept in slow. Flora stayed. She slept in the loft. Dallin gave her space, but not distance. He brought her warm bread, let her choose which horse to ride when she could manage. He never touched her without reason, never looked at her like she was broken. One morning she found him mending a fence near the northern pasture. She walked up, hands in her coat pockets. "I want to go back," she said. He looked up, brow furrowed. To Wyoming, to the place it happened. I need to see it, stand there, not as someone who lost everything, but someone who survived. Dallin studied her, then dropped his hammer. Then I will take you. Why? Because you do not ride into fire alone. She stared at him. You are not afraid of what people will say. He stepped closer, his voice steady. I do not care what they say. I care what you need. She did not speak. Her eyes burned. He reached out carefully, slow enough that she could pull away if she wanted, but she did not. His hand brushed hers. Warm, solid. I care about you, Flora. She did not pull back. Instead, she leaned in just enough to rest her forehead against his chest. The breath he let out was soft and steady, like he had been waiting for that moment. So had she. They rode north in early December. The land was quiet under frost. They spoke little, moved slow. When they reached the spot where her house once stood, nothing remained but blackened earth and a stone chimney. Flora dismounted. She walked to the spot where her kitchen had been. She knelt, ran her fingers through the ash and let out one long breath. Dallin stood behind her, silent. She turned. He is not coming back. I know, he died for me. No, Dallin said. He died for what they did to you. That was not your fault. I still loved him. I know. Flora took a slow step toward him, but that does not mean I cannot love again. His eyes met hers. Do you? She reached up, her fingers curling into the collar of his coat. I think I already do. He leaned down and their lips met, not rushed, not desperate, just real, warm, steady, like everything she had needed and thought she would never have again. When they pulled back, he rested his forehead against hers. Then let us go home, he said. She nodded. Together. And they rode south, the smoke behind them and a new life ahead. The road south wound slow through the Raton Pass, brittle with winter and heavy with silence. Flora rode beside Dallin, their horses moving at a careful pace, hooves crunching through patches of snow crusted over with ice. They'd said little since leaving the charred ground behind. She was grateful for his quiet, not absence, just stillness. He never filled the air with words when none were needed. The morning sun sat low, throwing long shadows across the rocks. They stopped where a narrow stream cut through a bend in the trail. Dallin dismounted to check the horse's shoes while Flora walked to the water's edge, crouching to rinse her hands. You said once you didn't grow up here, she said, not looking over her shoulder. I didn't, Dallin answered, tightening the cinch on his gelding. Kansas, west of Dodge. Wheat and wind. My father hauled freight for the railroad. Mama took in sewing. Flora stood, water dripping from her wrists. What brought you west? I stayed put too long. Watched the land get fenced, watched neighbors turn bitter over inches of property. I needed sky again. Trail work gave me that. She turned then, brushing damp hair from her cheek. You ever think of going back? He met her gaze, steady as always. No. They rode until dusk, reaching a small cabin Dallin had used 2 winters back when he helped a rancher near Cimarron with branding. It stood tucked into a grove, low to the ground, with a sod roof and a crooked stovepipe. The inside smelled of dust and pine. Flora swept the floor while Dallin brought in wood, neither of them speaking until the warmth began to settle around them. She leaned against the wall, watching the fire. You ever been married? He folded his coat over a chair. No, loved someone. I thought I did once, he said. She married a banker's son. I didn't fight it. Flora shifted. Why not? She wanted safety. I only had saddle scars and calluses. Flora nodded slowly, then looked toward the window. When I first met Wakasa, I thought I was just helping teach Cheyenne children letters. He asked questions no one else did, what I missed, what I dreamed. She paused. He never asked me to leave my world. Just made room for me in his. Dallin reached for the kettle, setting it over the fire. You think he'd want you to carry that loss forever? I don't know what he'd want, she said, voice barely above a whisper, but I know what I need now. He didn't press her. He poured the water, handed her a tin cup, and sat across from her on the floor. Flora sipped slowly. When you found me, how long had you been riding alone? Almost 6 years, she blinked. That long, I liked the quiet, until I didn't. What changed? His eyes didn't shift from hers. The fire popped, a soft snap of resin in the pine. Flora's breath caught. She set the tin down, rested her hands in her lap. "I can't give you what he gave me," she said. "I'm not asking for that," Dallin replied. "I only want what we can build from here." Later, when they lay on opposite sides of the small cabin, Flora listened to the wind press against the boards. She thought of the night her house burned, the roar, the smoke, the way the earth glowed like it had swallowed the sun. And now, the hush of this place. The slow, patient warmth of a man who'd seen her ruin and stayed anyway. Dawn rose cold and silver. They saddled up again. 2 days brought them to the edge of a ranch Dallin had worked briefly the year before. The owner, a lean woman named Tansy Boyd, allowed them to rest the horses and offered a meal in exchange for help splitting wood. Flora stepped into the barn while Dallin saw to the mules. Tansy handed her a small sack of flour. "You're with him now," Flora turned. "Yes," Tansy nodded once. "He's got a good heart, doesn't wear it on his sleeve, but it's there." "I know," Tansy studied her a moment. "You look like someone who's carried too much." "I have." Tansy handed her a tin of salt. "Then you'll know how to hold on tighter when it matters." As they rode out that afternoon, Flora glanced back once. The barn, the fencing, the tidy rows of stacked wood, it all looked like a different life. One she might have lived if things had gone another way. But she didn't linger in the thought. Ahead was the road they'd chosen, and beside her, a man who didn't flinch from what she'd been through. That night they camped near a slope of scrub oak, the stars sharp above them. Flora pulled her blanket tighter and looked toward the fire. "You think you'll stay in Colorado?" Dallin stirred the coals. "If you do," she didn't answer right away, "then I don't want to carry ghosts anymore. You won't have to." She looked across the fire at him. "Then yes, I'll stay." He didn't smile, just nodded once, his eyes never leaving hers. The wind shifted and she moved closer, settling beside him. Not touching, not speaking, just near, and in that nearness something steady settled between them. Not loud, not rushed, just true. By February, the plains had settled under snow like a held breath, and Flora found she no longer startled at the cry of a hawk or the sudden crack of frost under hoof. Each day began with small certainty, flour measured, wood stacked, horses fed side by side. The rhythm of life with Dallin unfolded not as escape, but as a kind of stitching, the slow mending of something frayed. He had found them a cabin tucked along the Purgatoire River, a half-day from Trinidad. It leaned slightly eastward, but the roof held and the stove burned hot. Flora whitewashed the inside walls. Dallin cut pine boughs to block drafts. They spoke of what was needed, not what was missing. One morning she stood at the edge of the frozen river, watching the pale light fold across the water's skin. Dallin came up behind her, his boots quiet in the snow. "I saw a rider on the west trail," he said. "Had a Cheyenne braid." Her breath caught, but she kept her gaze forward. "Wicassa's people wouldn't come without reason." "I asked him his name, said he was called Little Bear." Flora turned. "That's Wicassa's cousin." Dallin nodded. "He wants to speak with you." They met near the cottonwoods, where the snow thinned under low branches. Little Bear was younger than Wicassa, but carried the same stillness in his shoulders. He dismounted and handed Flora a small leather pouch. "He asked me to give you this," Little Bear said in Cheyenne. She opened it carefully. Inside were 4 eagle feathers bound with red thread. Her fingers shook. "He is gone," she said. Little Bear's expression didn't change, but his voice softened. "He rode into Fort Laramie. Killed 2 of the men who burned your place. Then he rode out. They followed. He led them east, away from our villages. He was found at the base of the Black Hills, frozen, blade in his hand." Flora knelt. Her knees pressed into the snow, and she bowed her head over the pouch. No tears came. Just a stillness that stretched to the tips of her fingers. "He fought for me," she said. "He didn't want you to carry that weight." Dallin stood behind her, silent. Little Bear looked toward him. "You're the one she walks beside now?" "I am." "Then know this, he did not die so she would live in shadow. He died so she could stand in the sun." Flora stood slowly. "Will you return to your people?" Little Bear nodded. "Spring camp will be near the Red Hills." "You are always welcome." She pressed his hand in thanks, then watched him ride off, his shape shrinking into the white horizon. That night she sat by the hearth, the pouch resting on the mantel. Dallin poured her tea and sat across from her. He found what justice he could, Flora said. Dallin watched the fire. He made sure they never did it again. A long silence stretched between them. I want to plant something, she said at last. Come spring, something that feeds us. What do you want to grow? Beans, maybe squash, something stubborn, he nodded. We'll break the ground together. Outside, the wind picked up, tapping the windows like branches seeking entry. Flora stood across the room and reached for Dallin's hand. You never asked me for anything, she said. I didn't need to. She stepped closer, her voice low. But I want you to have something. I want to build a life with you, not just survive beside you. His hand tightened around hers. Then let's make it ours. All of it? She leaned in, pressing her lips to his, not for comfort, not for forgetting, but because she wanted him to know she had chosen this, fully and without fear. His arms wrapped around her, steady as always, and this time she let herself rest there without looking back. When morning came, the snow had stilled. The sky stretched wide and blue above the cabin, and the trees stood quiet beneath it. Inside, Flora pulled on her coat and stepped into the sunlight, Dallin behind her, the earth waiting to be turned. By the time the thaw came, the river ran high with meltwater, and the soil along its banks turned soft underfoot. Dallin had cut a garden plot behind the cabin, just wide enough for 3 rows. He turned the earth with a worn spade, while Flora knelt nearby, smoothing seed into the damp soil with quiet care. She'd traded embroidery for seed at the mercantile in Trinidad pale beans, fat squash, a handful of turnip. The clerk hadn't spoken much, but he'd counted her change without flinching, which was more than most had done all winter. You want the rows straight? She asked, brushing hair from her brow. Dallin leaned on the handle of the spade. Straight enough that you can find 'em again come harvest. She smiled, but only briefly. The ground still held a chill and her fingers ached from the cold. Still, it felt good to coax something from the earth again. You ever plant anything before? She asked. Corn once, north of Cimarron. Didn't take. Why not? Too much wind, too little patience. She tilted her head. You've got more of both now. He walked to her side, crouched down. That's your doing. A jay called from the trees overhead. She didn't answer right away, just pressed another seed into the soil, slow and firm. I thought maybe I'd never do this again, she said quietly. Put something in the ground with hope. She felt his hand rest lightly on her back, not possessive, just present. Her shoulders eased. You're not alone this time, he said. That night, she patched a tear in his shirt by firelight while he sanded down a broken stirrup. They didn't talk much, but the quiet between them had changed. It held no hesitation now, only comfort. When she finished stitching, she set the shirt aside and looked across the small room. What did you want before all this, before you came west? He didn't look up right away, didn't have much in mind. Just knew I didn't want to be buried in the same dirt I was born in. And now, he ran a thumb over the worn leather in his hands. Now I want to wake up beside someone who makes the day worth starting. Her breath caught, but she didn't look away. You do. The words hung there a moment, soft but solid. He set the stirrup down and crossed to her, taking her hand. His palm was rough, warm, real. I'd like to marry you, Flora, he said. She blinked. You don't need to, I know, but I want to, not because of what we've been through. Because of what we're building now. She stood, still holding his hand. Then we will, when the beans bloom. They took their vows under the cottonwoods with Tansy Boyd and her oldest son standing witness. No preacher, no papers, just 2 hands joined and a promise spoken plain. Dallin carved their names into the lintel above the door when they returned home. Flora and Dallin, planted like seeds above the threshold. That night, after the fire had died low and the wind moved softly through the trees, she lay beside him, her head on his chest. His heartbeat was slow and steady beneath her ear. You think this will last? She asked. I don't wonder, he said. I just make sure it does. And in the dark, with his arm around her and the earth outside beginning to green, Flora believed him. For the first time in a long time, she saw no smoke on the horizon, only stars. By the time May warmed the earth firm enough to walk barefoot, the sprouts in Flora's garden had pushed free of the soil green, tender and stubborn in their own way. She rose early, sometimes before Dallin stirred, to check for deer prints or signs of birds digging for seed. Each time she crouched beside the rows, fingers brushing the leaves, she felt something settle inside her, not like forgetting, just the right kind of remembering. One morning, she came back inside with mud on her hem and a small, crooked bead in her hand. Dallin was at the table, sorting through a stack of hand-cut cedar planks for a henhouse he planned to build before the month ended. "They came early," she said, holding it up. He looked over, then pushed back his chair. "First thing we'll eat from our own ground." She set the bead on the table, brushing her palms on her apron. "We'll need more jars. If it's a good season, we'll be putting up pickles before the summer's half gone." "I'll ride into town tomorrow," he said. "Could use more nails too, and maybe a bit of sugar if you've got plans for those berries near the bluff." She nodded, already thinking ahead. "I could dry some of those leaves for tea." Dallin stood, stretching the stiffness from his shoulders. "Wouldn't mind that. You've got a steadier hand than any doctor I ever knew." She reached up, touching the edge of his jaw gently. "You ever think about what comes next for us?" He caught her hand in his, kissed her knuckles without a word. "Then, I think about it every time I see you in that garden." That evening they walked west of the cabin, where the land crested gently and the wind carried the scent of cottonwood and warming pine. Dallin had cleared a spot for a bench, built it with his own hands, and set it facing the long stretch of valley where the river curved like a dark thread. "This place feels like it's always been waiting," Flora said, brushing her skirt aside as she sat. "For what?" She looked up at him, her eyes steady. "For someone to belong to it." Dallin sat beside her, their shoulders touching. "You ever want to leave it?" She shook her head. "No, but I want more to come here. Maybe someday someone who looks like both of us." Dallin turned toward her, surprised. "You'd want children, after all that's come before," she nodded slowly. "I think I do, with you I do." He didn't speak at first, only reached for her hand again. The wind moved through her hair, lifting strands against his coat. "I'd raise them to know both sides," she said. "Not just the part that lives behind a fence or in a book, but the part that listens when the wind moves through the grass. They'd learn that from you. They'd learn strength from you." He drew her closer then, cradling the back of her head as he kissed her slow and sure. When he pulled back, there was no doubt in his eyes, only the quiet promise of a man who'd carried every piece of his life into this new one and laid it down beside hers. By midsummer, the garden had doubled in size. Dallin's henhouse stood firm at the edge of the pasture, with 6 hens and a red feathered rooster Flora named Alder. The kitchen shelves filled with jars of sweet preserves and pickled roots, and the pantry smelled of dried herbs and old wood. They hosted a supper in late July, inviting Tansy Boyd and her boys, along with a blacksmith's family Dallin had known from his trail days. Flora made stew with wild onions, and Dallin roasted a chicken he'd raised from a chick. They ate under the open sky, with lanterns strung between fence posts and fiddle music humming from a boy named Ellis. Later that night, after the guests had gone and the fire had died down, Flora stood barefoot in the garden, her hand resting low on her belly. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Dallin came to stand behind her, arms around her waist. He pressed his cheek to her temple. "You sure?" She laughed softly. "Yes, I'm sure." He kissed her hair, then her shoulder. "Then we'll make room. We've got room." Through that summer and into the fall, they built more than a home. They built a life full of slow mornings and shared labor, of hands held over harvest baskets and whispers exchanged beneath quilts stitched from both their pasts. Flora painted the window frames blue, and Dallin sanded the floor smooth after the first frost. They didn't pretend the world beyond their land had changed, it hadn't. But within the walls they'd built, kindness grew like roots under stone. When the baby came, One evening late the next spring, the sky was wide and cloudless. A girl, dark-haired and quiet-eyed, with a brow shaped just like Flora's and hands that curled around Dallin's finger like she'd been waiting for him her whole life. They named her Willa. Tansy came to help that first week, and Little Bear rode south with gifts from Wakasa's people, a blanket of fine hide, a necklace of carved bone. Flora wrapped Willa in the blanket each night, humming songs passed down through fire and silence. Years later, when Willa learned to walk, she followed the rows of the garden just as her mother had, her feet bare, her laughter bright in the morning air. And Dallin, watching from the porch with his arm around Flora, would turn to her and say, "Every seed you planted, look what it's grown." And Flora, heart full, would simply nod, because she already knew.